All right, Victor Vigiani, Zealand News Network, Zealand Communications is with us. And among other things, we're talking about David Grusch, Pentagon whistleblower, and his claims that the Vatican helped the United States retrieve a UFO from Benito Mussolini. Now, this made news headlines back in June of this year, but it's kind of gained some new currency because the organization that Victor is involved with, the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, or ICER, he's president of membership. And earlier this month, earlier in November, representatives from ICER interviewed David Grusch. So the actual retrieval, from what I understand, took place in about 1933.
33, yeah.
And it was then, it wasn't moved to a secure airbase in Italy until around 44 or 45.
45, yeah, almost 10,
so
more than 10 years, more than 10 years later. I think what happened there, from my understanding, is that the way the craft was located, the way it was found, at that time, I guess we're looking at a different context and a different era of understanding what these things might have been. The technology at the time, in the early stages of pre-World War II, was not anything like it was today. It back then, the idea that there might have been something of an extraterrestrial nature of anything among the general public now, okay, was so far removed from their context, from their own reality, from their understanding. It wasn't something that people talked about back then. This is one of the things that Paolo described to me, because people were basically illiterate about this kind of stuff. So that craft could have been anything. It could have been some sort of weird thing that fell from the sky. They didn't really have an understanding that, oh my goodness, there's a possibility that the government is hiding this because of their and all the things that we go through now, and in trying to understand what fell from the sky, in Roswell in 1947, that kind of thing. It was a totally different context as to what happened. So that means, I'm going to be assuming that the level of security that surrounded this thing was not nearly as tight as it should have been or could have been. And whoever did retrieve it did whatever with it and said, well, we don't know what it is. And other people made decisions about how that thing was going to be treated. And I think the Pope, when Pius stepped in, I think that's the point at which, once they informed the United States government that they had something, I think it sort of perked the interest of the national security establishment back then in 1933. And within that time period that you mentioned, they know we'd better get on this, because if it was 1944 or 45, when this thing was actually kind of maneuvered around, or at least hidden, the United States had gone through several events of a similar nature prior to Roswell. In 1942, there was a crash in Missouri, at which I guess not a priest, but some sort of minister was called to administer to a being that was at death's door at this crash in Missouri. And there's a long story about that he could almost spend a whole program on. So the United States had at that time a lot of experience with this kind of stuff. Just as bizarre, but their level of national security surrounding it was totally different than what Italy's was at that time. So it was approached in a totally different manner.
So it's moved to a secure location on an Italian Air Force base somewhere between 44 and 45.
Right.
Mussolini is executed. What did the New York Times call that? A fitting end to a wretched life.
Yes.
April 1945. So when is Pius XII working the back channels to get that UFO to the United States? Does that happen after Mussolini's death, or?
Yeah, apparently it did. Once that sort of threat was out of the way, I think the Vatican felt that it was more possible for them to communicate with the national security people in the United States, namely the president. So that kind of a communication after the war was a lot easier than during the war.
Sure.
Because if the Pope had done that, something 2 or 3 years earlier, maybe it would have been a different results, and maybe the military at the time would have clamped down on things. But because of the passing of Mussolini and the end of the war, I think it opened the door for some level of communication, because at the time Italy had no level of acuity or expertise or technological advantage at the time to examine this kind of stuff. And so I think that once the Pope made the overture to the president at the time, Roosevelt, I think they were taken seriously. And okay, boys, we'll take it over. We'll take it off your hands right now, because if they let it stay there, it would not receive any kind of investigation or treatment or examination anywhere close to what the United States did. But it also brought that thing over to the United States, but allowed the United States to clamp down on any information coming out about it, which is another kind of pillar of ideology or pillar of secrecy, that if the Vatican had tried to do something, or the military at the time, they'd have botched it up for sure. It would have been a mess. But now that it was over in the United States, the United States could cloak this thing in all the secrecy that they became famous for, beginning in 1942, and then at 1947 in Roswell, and following that. So it was a real way that Italy could just wipe its hands of all and give it to the United States, let them cover it up, because the Vatican didn't want to do it at the time, anyways.
Right. Did ICER get from Grusch any details about, I don't know, chain of custody from the time it leaves the Italian Air Force Base to when it arrives? How, what vessel it's on, or anything like that?
He may know about that, but they did not get into that in the interview. No. That would be really interesting to find out. But to my knowledge, there was no information about that.
Now, it would have been, well, Truman, Roosevelt was dead by 45, so it would have been Truman, assuming that the president was made aware of this.
Yeah.
Because I've never seen or read anything that really ties Roosevelt to, knowledge of UFOs, or am I wrong?
Well, no, I think you're right. Because it may have come up in cabinet meetings, because at the time, Foo Fighters were, chasing planes and all of that. But I don't think it was the time. The timing wasn't right for that administration to become involved in funny lights in the sky at the time.
Right.
So that just wasn't something that Roosevelt was, even, from my understanding, at all interested in.
No, I mean, there aren't rumors of secret meetings with aliens, like we have with, Eisenhower and so forth. So
right. And Truman admitting, a bald-faced admission on camera that, we talk about these things all the time in cabinet meetings. I mean, he's on the record as actually saying that. There is a clear video that, yes, and it's sort of like nonplussed. Yes, we do talk about that all the time. But it was never taken seriously, and it was all dampened down. And it's just some sort of form of folklore, or an old man talking out of his hat. Who knows? But the United States has ways of tamping down that kind of blockbuster information, especially during a time of war. When you're talking atomic bomb and all that other kind of information.